part that you don't have to know, the only thing, is repro. So I'm going to tell you kind of a summary of repro today of what you'll need to know for reproduction, but the rest I want you to know. You don't have to memorize these hows. If you once you read the transmission, that should just kind of make sense. I just gave this as like a supporting information. But here were some of the funky things that had to do with each organism, and I do want you to know those characteristics. Yeah.
When you say most common adults, you mean that adults are the ones who usually have the
Yes. So
like
that's
adult
the most
people.
common helminth infection in adults is Ascaris.
So we're talking about human adults.
Human adults.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah. And then in kids, the most common helminth infection are pinworms. Okay. So today we are going to finish our discussion on helminths. And then we might be done a tiny bit early, which will give us some time to spend and like chill and go through our unknown project. Okay, so let's do, what did we do? Helminths, we're doing DDX. Okay, so we talked about that they're multicellular, that they have organs and organ systems different than the microorganisms that we've talked about. We've talked about that they might have a rudimentary like nervous system, they might have a rudimentary digestive system. So we'll talk a little bit about reproduction today, how they reproduce. And I try not to get into too many semantics about details of their anatomy, but the only thing that why I always bring up sexual reproduction is for what reason?
Genetic diversity.
Genetic diversity. Awesome. So genetic diversity is what promotes the resistance to pharmaceuticals. Okay. So, so the only thing I am going to talk about with repro is that, so protozoa, their primary methodology of reproduction is asexual reproduction. So they mostly asexually reproduce. Some are able to sexually reproduce through those micronuclei. It's less common. Some are able to sexually reproduce. Most asexually reproduce. Well, the opposite is true with helminths. Helminths mostly sexually reproduce. Some are able to asexually reproduce. So what we're talking about now, we're bringing meiosis back into the picture. So we talked about mitosis, and so the reason I hate that word, this is why sometimes scientists are great, sometimes they're annoying. So is because when you talk about binary fission, the term binary fission, you're talking about an organism. Let's color code. So we're talking about like some sort of protozoa, and then there's going to be two protozoa that are the exact same in binary fission. We can also say cell cycle because they also have to go through their organelles, copying. Remember all those stages of the cell cycle. So the cell cycle was this round thing is what helped me remember it. What is this first stage? G1, and then this was S, G2, and all these three phases are called what? Interphase. Then in this little tiny pie, we have what? Mitosis and cytokinesis. And then mitosis has 4 stages. What are they? Prophase,
Anaphase, telophase.
and what those phases are, you know, a lot of biology classes will like drive those home. What's going on in prophase? What's going on in metaphase? What's going on in anaphase? What's going on in telophase? And they'll go through and have you draw it, and have you understand it, look at it under the microscope. The reason I don't really focus on it that much is because basically you're just saying the chromosomes are splitting off and going into separate cells. So here we're copying our organelles. here we're copying our genetic material, here we're proofreading, and then we're going into mitosis where we're separating our chromosomes. So the reason I focused here on metaphase was then you could count chromosomes. So now you can figure out how many chromosomes are going into one cell and how many chromosomes are going into the second cell. So that's the whole cell cycle. So binary fission, it is the cell cycle. That is what's going on. But we don't really call it the cell cycle in bacteria, even though we do call it binary fission. We don't really call it the cell cycle because they don't really go through this whole double checking process. They just, I mean, hypothetically they do, but it's not, they just go, 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 go. It's not really timed and controlled and regulated, but I mean, essentially I guess they do. Because they do have to copy they don't have organelles, but they do have to make more ribosomes. They have to make more cytoplasmic membrane. They have to make more peptidoglycan. So they do have to make more. They have to synthesize their genome. They do have a proofreader, and then they will go through and split their chromosomes. So we are talking about binary fission, but a lot of people will just name it mitosis. Does that make sense why that bugs me? Is because mitosis is just one little piece of this pie, and I don't even think it's the most important part of the pie. This is probably the most important part of the pie, right? Okay, so then we'll talk about meiosis. So we talked about meiosis a ton already, but why, so when we're talking about helminths, and we're talking about sexual reproduction, then we're talking about an egg, and we're talking about a sperm, which their sperm don't look the same, but we'll just go with it. You have an egg and a sperm, and so these can come together to form a brand new type of helminth that has not been seen before. So genetic recombination is what we worry about, but meiosis is the process of making those gametes. Yeah, okay. So that was just kind of a little review. I liked this because I liked kind of comparing meiosis and mitosis. The reason that the verbiage bothers me is because we're talking about one piece of a larger puzzle of synthesis and all of that kind of stuff, but we'll just go with it. Okay, so the only things that I wanted you to know are that helminths sexually reproduce for the most part. There is asexual reproduction in helminths, so they can form another helminth from this egg itself, so they can asexually reproduce, but it's less common. More commonly, they'll sexually reproduce and come up with an offspring just like we will. Yeah?
So, from the gamete, is it gonna have half of the DNA from the egg? And be able to do
So
that?
no, that's a good question.
Is that a pod? Like what are those things called?
An egg? Ova?
They're like the flatworms have like the little.
Oh, like the proglottids?
Yes.
Oh, yes. Let's talk about proglottids in a second, remind me, because
Okay.
that's a good question.
Okay.
So, and that is a form of asexual reproduction. So what they would do, so this helminth, for example, would have a gamete that was diploid. So this gamete, if it does asexually reproduce, this gamete has to have all of the chromosomes to
Okay.
make another organism.
So it can't be like fungi or.
Yeah, where
Okay.
they can do whatever they want. They can live with half the number of chromosomes, or they don't have to. They can do whatever they want. Yeah, great question. So if they do sexually reproduce, they have to have half and half. If they asexually reproduce, they have the whole, and they'll just sprout out another helminth. Yeah.
So, are there helminths that do sexual and asexual both?
Yes, there are. And there are helminths that are hermaphroditic. So the helminth itself, this is getting too much that you guys don't need to know, but just to talk about it. One part of the helminth will produce sperm, one part of the helminth will produce eggs, and then they'll meet up and it is a genetically identical, but this is still considered sexual reproduction.
Well, that's silly. Why would they separate it just to put it back together?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's per chance of having sexual reproduction,
Okay.
yeah.
That makes sense, I guess.
Yeah, you guys have reached my helminth knowledge. Yeah.
I was gonna ask another question, I'm probably.
No, go ahead.
I don't know, like, on that note also, if it comes from just a single egg, if the egg is a sex cell, that would seem to me that would still be a form of sexual reproduction, even though there's not a formal, like, conjugation.
Yeah, it is.
Thing.
Yeah, it is a form of sexual reproduction. If if it's a hermaphrodite and it's able to sexually reproduce itself.
Sorry, I was referring to the other case of where just the egg cell by itself is able to turn into another life form. Since the egg is a sex cell, I figured that would still constitute sexual reproduction, but it's called asexual.
Yeah, it's called asexual reproduction when it's its own genome.
Okay.
But this is also its own genome, and that is considered. But it's like pairing up half genomes to make a new combination, I guess.
So that's the sexual part.
That's the sexual part.
Okay.
Yeah. This is, it gets really weird when you're talking about, like, even in plants, like if you ever take botany, not just protozoa are weird and not just fungi are weird. Plants are super weird in the way that they reproduce too. And it's not always just a black and white that makes sense to us. There's all kinds of different ways that they can reproduce too. So, yeah. Okay, so it's a great time to review mitosis and meiosis, and I just wanted to kind of clarify, like, I don't know if it clarified or made it more confusing, but when we're talking about mitosis, we're talking about binary fission, we're talking about the cell cycle. When we're talking about meiosis, we're talking about the formation of gametes that meet together to make a genetically recombined adult. Yeah?
Do you want us to know the differences between the sexual and asexual and how this form could be asexual, this form could be sexual?
No.
Okay, just know that
Just
they can do
mitosis and
sexual
they
and asexual.
Yes, but mostly sexual, yes. Mostly asexual in protozoa, mostly sexual in helminths.
Okay.
Yes, and then just know the basis of mitosis and meiosis for life, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so let's talk about diagnostic considerations. So when we're talking about, like, okay, if you go home today, which hopefully you won't, but you have the flu, or somebody in your house, you're like, I have the flu, I don't feel good. You kind of know where they got it, right? You're like, oh, probably got it from work. Oh, is anybody around you sick? And you kind of know the questions to ask. If somebody comes home with that you might assume that they have a protozoal infection, it's weird, right? You'd be like, where did you pick that up? Like, where would you have to have come in contact with it in some way that, where that organism lives. Well, the same is true with helminths. If somebody had a helminth infection, you would for sure start thinking of where did that come from? Where did you get it? And so we've already talked about that in our little chart too as transmission, but let's just think about what you might be asking your patient. So the funky thing about helminths are that there's so many different types of tissue tropism for helminths. So they can live in the tissues, they can live in the intestines, they can live in the lungs, they can live all over. So there's all kinds of different signs and symptoms that have to do with helminths. So let's just go through a couple of them really quick. So a cough. So they can burrow into the lungs, and some helminths, that's one thing that they do is they burrow into the lungs. And then when they burrow into the lungs, that's part of their life cycle. I don't know specifically, but there are certain helminths that they have to live in the lungs. And then they develop in the lungs, and once they develop in the lungs, then the patient will cough it up and they will move down into the intestines. So some of them have to spend their life cycle in the lungs, but what I'm trying to get at with this whole list is actually there's a wide array of helminth symptoms. So let's figure out how we can kind of narrow it down. So a rash, they could have something cutaneous or superficial if it's underneath the skin. Abdominal pain, diarrhea, that all makes sense. They could have, it's a cyst, so I shouldn't have called it a cyst, I should call it a granuloma. But so your patient might come in and say, I have a cyst. But don't get confused with what a cyst is, because we've called cysts protozoa eggs, right? We've called that's what protozoa make our cysts. This is a different kind of cyst. This is more like, I have a bubble underneath my skin. What is it? So it could be in the muscle, they could have something in the eyes, they could hopefully not, and have something in the brain, because if they burrow, there's really no limit where they can go. So eosinophilia, I'll talk about in a minute. Anemia, so they could have problems with their bloodstream. Rectal itching, that is huge for pinworms. Rectal prolapse is common actually for helminths that live in the colon. Bloody stool, that's dysentery or worms in the stool. Sometimes, I actually forgot to give you this example. My husband's sister, her name's Annalisa, she went to Honduras after she graduated high school because she wanted to learn Spanish. She took Spanish through high school, but she wanted to become fluent in Spanish, so she spent a year in Honduras. She's fluent in Spanish, she teaches Spanish, but she got worms, and there were worms in her stool, and so she knew she had intestinal worms. She had huge problems with it. She had to fly home early. They did intestinal surgery, and they had to remove a portion of her colon because it had dug so much into her colon that it actually caused necrosis. It caused death of that tissue. So they had to cut it out, and she still has intestinal issues because of it. So yes, there can just be like worms in the stool. Okay, so in children always get cranky is their first resource. Even teenagers. I'm just kidding. So their first sign is crankiness, and they're like, oh, they won't calm down. Sometimes it's malaise, it's tiredness, like, oh, my kid has been sleeping for like 48 hours. That is not normal. Like, what is going on with my kid? So signs and symptoms for kids, it just makes you think like something's wrong. Okay, this kid is tired, this kid is cranky, something's wrong with the kid. What is it? You'd probably think helminths last, unless they're itching their bum. Then you'd think helminths first. So we'll just kind of go through that. Eosinophilia, so we'll talk about this a ton in the next week or so, is there's all kinds of different white blood cells. So in our white blood cell line, you don't have to know this yet, but out of our white blood cells, we have B cells, we have T cells, we have natural killer cells, we have macrophages, we have neutrophils, we have dendritic cells, we have mast cells. You're gonna know all these next week. We have basophils, and we have eosinophils. So eosinophils, each one has kind of their own little characteristic of, like, if your patient has an infection and they have high B cells, what does that mean? If your patient has an infection, they have high T cells, what does that mean? High or low? If your patient has macrophages, maybe. So you look at their blood count, and I'll show you that next week, and you say like, oh, they have high this is going to start putting me in a certain direction of what my patient might have. Well, if your patient has high eosinophils, that's one of our little clues that it might be a helminth infection. So this is called eosinophilia, where a patient has high eosinophil count when you draw their blood, and a high eosinophil count kind of leads us to a helminth infection. And eosinophils, are triggered by a larger organism infection. So it's just something that our body does. Okay, so we'll talk more about eosinophilia as we go along, but that's a sign that it might be a helminth infection. So Ascaris, 1 billion worldwide. That's crazy amount. whipworms, hookworms. These are all too high for my liking. And infections in meat, you know, we might not think it's that common, but they are common. And Dr. Myers just gave us a horror story before we got here, was that if you don't cook meat properly, it is a high risk of infection, but also we do have better controls in our meat producing companies, but also in our how butchers handle meat. So when butchers handle meat, they're supposed to inspect for helminth infections, and they're supposed to cut it out. So they're supposed to inspect for that and make sure, because actually it's way more common than you think it is. There's a video on it, but I'll spare you how disgusting it is. But they're supposed to look for that and cut them out and get them out for the most part, hopefully. But one way that people will get helminth infections is if they eat wild animals, like people that eat game, because it's not inspected, and they're just eating what's out natural in the environment, where farmed animals, in our country at least, we have some sort of regulations of what those animals can eat and drink. Okay. So symptoms, lots of symptoms depending on the area of infection. So how do we diagnose if we have so many different options for symptoms? How do we know? Well, you know, if your patient has traveled anywhere, and if your patient, I would say when your patient has traveled somewhere, you would think more protozoa helminth than you would if they didn't travel somewhere. So if your patient's like, I just got back from wherever, and you're like, oh, then broaden my horizons. What else could it be other than the traditional stuff? Except Ascaris is a little bit more popular here, so it could be something like that, but you would think more like a patient can actually live a long time with a tapeworm, or live a long time with an Ascaris infection. So maybe chronic infections, like I've had gastrointestinal symptoms for a really long time. Maybe somebody else in my family also is having gastrointestinal symptoms, something like that. Just something to think about. So thinking about children, about how they might have acquired an infection, sandbox, standing in water or soil. So patients whose hobbies it is to fish or to garden, or if they are on a boat and they're not filtering their water properly, if they've been on a boat for a long time, that kind of thing. People who work in fields, people who work in, there was actually a helminth infection story I heard about from, he cleaned sailboats for a living. So, you know, working out in a wharf and cleaning sailboats, he was, had exposure. So raw, undercooked meat or seafood. So somebody who maybe eats sushi that is old, or hasn't, maybe from somewhere that's not a reputable place. Someone that eats wild game. Someone that likes their burgers raw. Like don't, if you do eat burgers, cook them. So that kind of thing. Okay. So our diagnostic tools, so I'll show you what our diagnostic tools are. I have some slides on that. So remember, for protozoa, it was ova and parasite test, it was a blood smear, and it was, what was our third one? Yes, vaginal or urethral, yes, vaginal urethral swab, yes. So you can track outbreaks, helminth outbreaks, so that's something to look at. If I would think my patient might have a helminth infection, Google it, or look at WebMD or whatever it is that you look at, and okay, is there something going around? But also here are some of the laboratory tests that we're gonna talk about. So one is the ova and parasite stool sample. So now we're looking for eggs. We're not looking for parasites. We're not looking for the cyst of a protozoa. Now we're looking for the eggs of a helminth. So a tape test. So I'll show you what that is. That's our note card for today, what a tape test is, how to look for a pinworm infection. An x-ray. So if a patient has abdominal cramping and has had it for a while and is losing weight, having trouble digesting, things like that, if they get an x-ray, then it will show the helminth in their abdomen. So you could see a tapeworm, you could see ascaris infection, things like that from an x-ray. Another method is doing a complete blood count, or a CBC that I talked about, where we look at how many white blood cells that we have, red blood cells that we have, things like that. You take a blood sample and then they'll tell you what percent is in the normal range for each of the white blood cells. And if there's high eosinophils, it might trigger our thoughts that maybe it is a helminth infection. And then an ELISA. We don't know what an ELISA is yet, so I don't want you to stress about that. Just know the word ELISA. We're going to do an ELISA in the lab. It's called an enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay. And actually you don't have to know what it is because you already know what it is. It's basically like a COVID test. That's when you put the water and you put the sample in there and it moves up the litmus paper to tell you if it's positive or negative. That is basically what an ELISA is in a little bit of a way. That's called a serotest. But we'll talk about what an ELISA is, but now you kind of know what it is, and we'll do that in the lab. Okay, so this is just an example of, this one is an OMP test, and this patient has cysts present, and here ova are not present, so this is just one that I pulled off the internet, but you can look and find ones that have ova, ones that have cysts. This is cystic trophozoites of protozoa, and here's ova for helminths, but it's just something that I pulled off the internet. But one thing I wanted to tell you about was how hard it is to detect eggs in the stool. So eggs in the stool is a great method. That's probably the most common method, is to take a stool sample and look at it under the microscope. That's mostly what they do. But they're trying to figure out new ways to detect it earlier because they're hard to find in the feces, and there has to be a large quantity of them. You have to have a skilled lab technician to be able to make sure that they found them. But it says the first days of eggs detected about day 69, and here it was ELISA positive at day 31. So it's earlier testing when you do that litmus test, when you do almost like a COVID test. But I'll show you what an ELISA is when we get to that. So there are better ways of detection. I would guess most people don't do an ELISA, but some labs will. And especially if they think your patient is positive, then it's all systems go. Then they'll double check and go through all the processes. They probably will run a PCR test and check to see if that's what your patient really has. Okay, so this is called an anthelmintics. So we talked about antibiotics, we talked about antivirals, we talked about antifungals, we talked about antiparasitics. This is an anthelmintic, and we're only gonna have one. So why are helminths so hard to treat?
They're eukaryotes.
Yes, resistant, they can be resistant, but also they are so much like us, right? Like they don't have peptidoglycan, they don't have chitin and ergosterol and manoproteins. They don't have anything that's different than ours. They're the same. So how can we treat them? Well, we treat them with this is the most common medication to treat helminth infection with, is called albendazole. So this is albendazole, and what it does is it prevents the formation of microtubules. So microtubules are the proteins where you have a normal cell. Then this cell is going to go through S phase. Then it's going to go through mitosis and PMAT. And here we have those centrioles. And here we have it pulling the chromosomes opposite away from each other. So here these microtubules are pulling the chromosomes to separate directions. So that's one thing that it does, is it blocks the formation of these microtubules that pull the chromosomes apart. Yeah.
Does that block it in our cells also?
Yeah, so I'll show you what happens in our cells. So here it does that, but also what it does is it blocks an enzyme in the citric acid cycle. So in the citric acid cycle, there's an enzyme called malate dehydrogenase that I don't care that you know what that is. But within the Krebs cycle, there's a ton of enzymes that we're working to break off those hydrogens, right? For NADH and FADH2. We're working on breaking off those hydrogens. One of the enzymes that helps us do that is called malate dehydrogenase. So it's going to block that enzyme so that the citric acid cycle will back up and not function anymore. So we're blocking ATP synthesis. So what happens in humans? Well, this is a paper that I found on PubMed that talks about non-disjunction events induced by albendazole. So what is non-disjunction? So what non-disjunction is, so for example, if your patient is taking albendazole and some of these microtubules didn't form correctly, then what's going to happen is, here's your little centriole. So this one is not formed correctly, this one's not formed correctly, this one's formed correctly. So this one grabbed a chromosome. Over here, we had, this one worked fine, this one worked fine, this one worked fine, this one's broken. So what happens is that because this microtubule and this one didn't function together, this chromosome will carry both. It didn't split. This microtubule wasn't able to pull them apart. Does that make sense? So here, all of these chromosomes ended up together. This one didn't end up with a chromosome, this one ended up with a chromosome together. So they're not splitting apart. So you end up with a cell that has two, and this cell has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. None of them are like the original cell, and so these ones will both die. So that's called non-disjunction. So non-disjunction happens because those chromosomes are not breaking apart. So as a result, these are the common side effects of albendazole: stomach pain, nausea, vomiting, headache, dizziness, reversible hair loss, black tarry stools, bleeding gums, blood in the urine or stools, chest pain, pinpoint red spot, sore throat, sore ulcer, blah, blah, blah. Because it's actually causing cell death, and especially of reproducing cells. So this is exactly what chemotherapy does. So chemotherapy stops the division, it stops the cell cycle. It blocks the timing methodology of the cell cycle. So it can't go through the cell cycle. So all the cells that are already there are fine, but any cells that are rapidly dividing cells that go through the cell cycle more rapidly are affected by chemotherapy, like the hands, the feet, the mouth, the hair follicles, things like that. So that's why patients will get ulcers in the mouth, they'll lose their hair, sometimes they get sores on their hands and feet, they can have like vaginal problems or things like that because of cellular reproduction. They're having problems with cells that reproduce rapidly. So same thing with albendazole. So yes, helminths are very hard to get rid of. Yeah, no, great, yeah, always ask, for sure. Don't memorize any of those, just know.
Causes side effects.
Yes, a lot of side effects, yeah. So, and know why. It's because microtubule formation, and it's because of it blocks an enzyme in the citric acid cycle. So know both of those, great question. So what I also wanted to say about this is that another way that we can get rid of a helminth infection is surgery. So they can remove the helminth through abdominal surgery, but they are also hard to get rid of that way because they lay eggs, and there's just so many eggs, so that's difficult as well. So I just wanted to mention dog heartworms because dogs have to take medication. Jump in, because I don't know very much about it. So dogs have to take medication to prevent heartworms because heartworms are actually really common in dogs, and it's a type of a helminth that only lives in the hearts of dogs. And there are other animals that it can affect too, but dogs' hearts are their primary tissue tropism. They're where they like to live. And they, I don't know, I don't know if they're fecal oral, if they get it from eating other dogs' poo.
It's fecal.
From mosquitoes? Oh, interesting.
Fecal oral as well.
Fecal oral as well? Oh, crazy. Okay, so yeah, I just wanted to show you what that is. For dogs have to take heartworm medication regularly to prevent it. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so we're just gonna do a quick little identification. So don't look ahead if you have the slides in front of you, see if you can guess. So first, write it down on your notebook, and then we'll say it out loud. So that one is, I'm gonna have it up here. Write it down really quick. First of all, is it a flatworm or a roundworm? That's a flatworm. That one is called a what? A tapeworm, which is also called a cestode. Yes, so this is a cestode. This is a tapeworm. Oh, and we didn't get a chance to talk about asexual reproduction in cestodes, but that is what happens. Those little proglottids can break off and asexually reproduce and form another tapeworm.
We talked about it a little bit last time.
Yeah, you
Oh, this time. Oh, cool. Oh, yeah. Okay. So that is a cestode. That's what a tapeworm looks like. So write it down. So is this a flatworm or a roundworm? Flatworm. So we only have two types of flatworms, and we know it's not a cestode, so it must be a fluke or a trematode. So this is a trematode or a fluke. It looks like a leech, right? It looks like kind of the belly of a leech, but that's what they look like, is they look like leeches. Okay, so here, let's look at this one. Write it down on your paper. So that one is a what? Ascaris, yep, Yep, that's an ascaris, that's a roundworm. A nematode, right? These are all nematodes. What's this one?
Pinworm.
That's a pinworm. That's the tiny, tiny ones.
Do they treat pinworms with this albendazole
Albendazole,
as
yes,
well?
yes. And I think that there is some sort of pediatric version, but don't quote me on that. But there is something that also, some people say like there's a homeopathic way that they try and get rid of them, like they can do like some sort of garlic treatment, I don't know, don't quote me, I'm not sure. Okay, and then these ones, what are these ones?
The whipworms.
Whipworms. These ones look like little whips, thicker on one side, thin on the other side. These are whipworms. And then this one, we're gonna guess, is a hookworm. So hookworms are very burrowing friendly. And if there's something underneath the skin, 9 times out of 10, it's going to be a hookworm. They're able to penetrate very easily. They get into skin easily. That's their method of transmission. Okay, so Ascaris, pinworms, hookworms, hookworms. Okay, so here's our helminth wrap-up and then we're done. So they're parasitic worms, some are microscopic, some are macroscopic. They have a complicated life cycle, but we're just gonna keep it simple to eggs, larvae, adult. The larvae and adult they have different methodologies of transmission, even between the egg and the larvae and the adult, they have different methods of transmission. Fecal oral is huge. Undercooked meat is huge if they're burrowing. Some are free swimming so that they can burrow in that way. Some are asexually and sexually reproduced, but primarily sexually. Don't forget that. Yeah.
In the examples that we're learning, is there anything besides the hookworm that's free swimming?
So flukes are. Flukes are the other one that can waterborne free swimming transmission.
Okay.
Yes. Most are facultative anaerobes, so most can utilize oxygen, but they don't have to utilize oxygen either, so most are facultative. That's just as much as I want to say on that. We kind of get the point now. Eosinophilia is a common symptom. Weight loss, diarrhea, granulomas are those little tissue cysts, like the tissue, I don't want to call it a cyst, tissue tumors. Intestinal blockage, tissue pain, subcutaneous infections. Helminthiasis is difficult to treat and it can be more common than we think. Okay, so we're gonna do our note card and then we will head down to the lab. So this week we don't have very much reading. Oh, did I show you this Ascaris last time? Didn't we do Ascaris last time? Oh no, we didn't. We did our last. Oh yeah. Okay, so I'm skipping that. Oh, am I skipping toxoplasma? I can't. I can't. Can I? No, I can't skip it. Okay. Okay. Let me just make sure that we are going to be on track. Because we have plenty of time. We're just gonna be a little bit off with our note cards, but we'll be fine because we have plenty of time. So this is our last protozoa. I thought our last protozoa was our last one. This is our last protozoa. So this is Toxoplasma gondii. So this is our last protozoa. Are these, what is their method of motility? These are non-modal. Are these cysts or trophozoites? These ones are actually the trophozoites. Do they form cysts? Toxoplasma? I can't remember. Sorry, say that again, Dr. Daly-Nardis, did you say something?
Can you tell visually from the right?
Usually it's because the cysts will just look like eggs. And the trophozoites kind of look like bananas.
Okay.
They look like little slugs. Let me see from protozoa. I can't remember off the top of my head. They are both, because I think only the trichomonas.
Yeah, cystic because you can get it from feces.
From feces, that's
So
right.
it has to be
be.
cysts.
Yeah. Yes, so just trypanosoma and trichomonas are the only two that don't have. Yeah, great. Okay. So protozoa, this causes toxoplasmosis. It's non-modal. Fecal oral transmission. It can be from undercooked meat or seafood because it can be in any type of tissue, right? This is the one that was non-specific to the tissue trophic area that it liked to live in. And then it also can be vertically transmitted from mother to child. Most have no symptoms. but it also can be gastrointestinal. And it can be invasive, systemic, so it can be like in the blood. I'll show you a picture of one of the more common ocular toxoplasmosis. So most recover without treatment. It can be a patient that's immunocompromised, 11% of the US population. These always seem so high. It's like, it seems like everybody would have something. We just like have so many, I don't know.
Is that like at any point in their life?
It said has had toxoplasmosis. Oh, maybe, so at some point in their life have had it. Okay, let me just show you a picture real quick and then I'll come back to this one. So, vertical transmission, it can be from animals, from the cysts that are in tissue, and then also from cats from their feces. So, pregnant mothers are not supposed to change cat litter. So here's a picture of ocular toxoplasmosis when they get into the retina of the eye. Here is a picture, here's a slide, a histological slide of myocardial toxoplasmosis. So toxoplasmosis in the heart, in the myocardium. Here's how many cats have toxoplasmosis worldwide in different areas of the world. A little bit frightening. Okay, so I'll go back to this one. If there are any questions that you have about your unknown project, Dr. Rosemary and I can answer them now, or can go downstairs and we can look at your plates with you and things like that. But hopefully you've got a plan going on.